Hey guys, my guest today is Ralph Ellis, and we're going to be talking about the legend of King Arthur. See you in about 5 minutes. Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust. Turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Hey everybody, how's everyone doing? I hope you had a great day. I know I did. I got a great show ahead for you. My name is Charlotte. I'm going to be your host for the next 2 hours, hour and a half, 2 hours. We're going to go a little extended today, because the guest requested. He has a lot of things to share with us. Anyway, I'm Charlotte. I'm also the owner of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team based out of Sacramento. We are 45 strong up and down the state of California, which means if you do have a paranormal need, or you think you might have a paranormal need, we have access to clergy, we have access to our psychics, we have access to you. It may take us a while to get out there because California is a huge state. But just be patient because, like I said, we could always have one of our mediums call you to either figure out what's going on or help you out, get everything calmed down. But again, we do work with, in certain cases, we do work with clergy as well, depending on what's going on with the cases. Okay, if you're watching today from Facebook, we have a big Facebook presence. We have several pages. So if you're watching from either my profile or California Haunts Ghosts Events, and you haven't done so yet, you like what you hear, click that follow button. Okay? We're always looking for followers. In addition, if you like what you hear, show me some love. Hit those like buttons. Okay? Hearts and all that stuff. Because the more you do it and the more it shows up, the higher I go on the algorithm. Works the same way for YouTube. We have a YouTube page where there's 569 videos, I think, sitting over there now. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, let's see if I can do this. Nope, that's not the right. I'll do it this way. Sometimes I'm such a ditz. If you look at that spot right there, your bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a ghost with a magnifying glass and a Sherlock Holmes hat on. That's the mascot. You click on that, that'll pop up that subscribe button. Because we're always over YouTube looking for subscribers. We're trying to build up, right? That's the whole point of it all, is to build up. Build up, build up, build up. So, yeah, that's only even if you didn't like what you heard and you want to just join to harass me or or get one of your enemies and someone you can't stand to watch the show, we're good. You can do that. But that would really help me out a lot. We do air every night, Monday through Sunday, on these channels, on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, 4 or 5 different channels. Plus, we have an RSS feed that goes out all over the world. So it's kind of cool. So yeah, like I said, and if you're kind of apprehensive about signing up, take a look at the YouTube videos, because I'm a journalist. I don't always like to do paranormal things. Okay, so I like to vary it. So check it out. I'm sure there's a topic that you guys will like, that you'll find you like. Okay. That being said, my guest tonight is Ralph Ellis. We're going to be talking about Okay, so I'm a big fan of King Arthur and the Round Table Legends. I've relatives over in the UK. I got to go to Canterbury and all these different places. It was cool. And so I'm just so excited to have him on to talk about the Holy Grail and that stuff. Plus, he's going to be talking about Jesus Christ in relation to all this other stuff. So it's going to be an interesting interview. I suggest, like the thing says, grab some popcorn, put your feet up, enjoy the ride. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Mr. Ellis in, and he can tell you about himself. Here we go. Hello.
Greetings. Good to be with you, Charlotte.
I'm out of breath now. All that chit chat. Tell me about you, sir.
Well, I'm a polymath, I suppose. I've been involved in many industries, from computing to aviation, and I've written 14 books so far on these topics, mostly about revisionary theology, I tend to call it, which is trying to find evidence for the stories, the biblical stories in the historical record. I've done a couple of books on the megaliths, the pyramids and the henges and things of that nature. And just then, as a little extra, sort of the icing on the cake, I did this book on Arthurian legend, because I kept coming across all of these hints to Arthurian legend within the work that I was doing. And so that sort of, dare I say, rewrote Arthurian legends. So any purists out there, you might be a little bit shocked, because this is a slightly different story to the normal Arthurian history. So yeah, that's kept me busy for about 40 years or something.
I can imagine.
um, quite some time. My first book came out in 1997, I think.
So it says, from what I'm seeing from your nameplate, it says you're a cardinal, correct?
Yeah, well, I've joined into this pronouns business. You can call yourself whatever you want nowadays, apparently. So I tend to have a different pronoun on every single YouTube I do. So today I'm a cardinal. Just,
That works.
why not?
Scared me for a second there.
We can be what we want to be
Wow.
nowadays.
Growing up Catholic, I was holding when I saw cardinal. I was like, whoa,
Yes.
I better be really good
No, I
today.
don't think the Catholics would approve.
So, in your studies, and I know we're going to be talking about the actual king, the King of Kings, right? We're going to be talking about that the first half of the show. What did you find parallel-wise? Because I know, if you look through history, there are parallels. They're thin, out of the Bible and whatnot, but there are parallels. So, what did you find the most interesting about, say, the Arthurian legend parallels?
There were quite a few hints when I was going through the sort of gospel stories, that these stories were linked and the history was linked. And it sort of hinted that I should really do a deep dive into what Arthurian history was all about, because I didn't actually understand it at that point. Like most people, I just watched the films, I'd read the books, I read a few. I hadn't read it much in the way of manuscripts at that point. I just read Wolfram von Eschenbach, and I hadn't really taken in the story as I should have done.
Mm-hmm.
It's very easy to read a story and skip over the elements that don't actually make sense because you cannot put them into the story properly. But later, when I read it all again, it made the story look very different indeed. So it's a good illustration that you have to know the subject very well before you can understand what it's talking about.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about the greatest king of all.
Yeah, well, how does he come into this? Which is quite interesting. It's because of all this work. I wrote 5 books on the New Testament, looking at the historicity, they call it, of the New Testament. They're trying to find it in the historical record. And I believe I did. Now, we're not going to go through this in any great detail because that's a 2-hour talk on its own. But I think I found the gospel story in the history of Edessa, which is a city-state up in northern Syria, 1st century, a small principality. And there seem to be a lot of connections there. So the first thing we really need to know is that, well, as you just said in your introduction, the King of Kings, that Jesus was a king, a real king, not a pretend king. So not a pauper carpenter, a pauper prince of peace, as they like to cast him, but a real king, a king of the Jews, which that's his title on 36 occasions in the New Testament. And then he's called the Christ and the Messiah. Well, the Christ just means king, basically. It's the anointed priest king of the Jews. So, yes, that's a secular king, just as King David was the Messiah. And Cyrus the Great was called the Messiah in Kings and Chronicles. So, yes, those titles apply to real kings. And that's why one of the many, many reasons why I think Jesus was a real king. The second thing we need to know, we'll just spend 15 minutes or so on this before we launch into Arthurian legend.
Okay.
But the second thing we really need to know is that Edessa has been deleted from history. And that's why you cannot find it in the biblical record or the historical record. It's just sort of not there. And that was done on purpose. And we know this by a comparison between Josephus Flavius and Moses of Chorene. So Josephus Flavius being the Judaic historian, the primary historian of 1st century history of the Near East, basically. He wrote everything that happened in that region in the 1st century. And then Moses of Chorene is a Syriac historian, from a little bit later. He's about 7th century, but writing similar stories, but from a Syrian perspective, and they had a different perspective, mainly because they had been cut off from Western Christianity. So that was cut off by the Council of Nicaea, by the Council of Chalcedon, and then by the Iron Curtain of Islam, which shut off Western Christianity from Eastern Christianity completely, both from Eastern Greek Orthodox and from Eastern Syriac Christianity. So whatever they were doing in Rome, they had no control whatsoever over what people in the East were writing about Jesus and the gospel stories. And that's an advantage, because now we get two different perspectives. We get the Roman version, the Josephus Flavius version. But over in the East, they had some slightly different stories and some different priorities, you might say, because these Edessan kings were their kings and they wanted to write their history. And from this, we know that Edessa has been deleted from the works of Josephus. Well, you can tell that by just keying in Edessa and doing a search, and it'll come up with nothing found. And then you can key in the kings of Edessa, which is King Abgarus and King Manu, and again, it'll say nothing found, which is unusual because Josephus Flavius knows everything that's happening in that region. So why does he not mention them? Well, we come to the war between Aretas and Herod Antipas. Now, this is biblical, which is why this is interesting, because this is the story of John the Baptist. Everyone knows the story of John the Baptist. He got beheaded because he was complaining about a marriage between between Herodias and Herod Antipas. And because he complained about this marriage and said it was illegal, he managed to get his head cut off and taken on a platter to Herod. Well, that little story is not just in the biblical story in the Gospels, it's also in the works of Josephus Flavius. And he mentions it because it involved the kings of this region. And what he says is that King Aretas got upset with this because it was his daughter that was spurned and sent home during this. So he wasn't very happy. So he made war upon Herod Antipas. And Josephus says of this, King Aretas made war between him and Herod Antipas, and he raised armies on both sides, and they prepared for war. And when they had joined battle, all of Herod's army was destroyed by the treachery of some fugitives who, although they were from the tetrarchy of Philip, which is Syria, they joined with Aretas's army to defeat Herod Antipas. So this John the Baptist business, there was actually a big battle over this. It wasn't just John the Baptist getting beheaded. There was a huge, great battle. But the battle involved some strange fugitives from Syria. And you have to wonder, come on, Josephus, you know everything that's happening in this region. Why can't you tell us who these fugitives are? You know, he's holding back here. There's some information he's not giving us. So how do we find that information? Well, we go to Moses of Corene, who's a Syriac historian, chronicler, and he gives us the same story. But he gives us the different angle on this, the different perspective. And he says King Abgarus of Edessa allied himself with King Aretas of Petra and gave him some auxiliary troops to make war upon Herod Antipas. Being sharply attacked, Herod's troops were defeated thanks to the help of the brave Edessans. As if by divine providence, vengeance was taken for the death of John the Baptist. Same story, very different perspective. So here we suddenly find out who these fugitives are that Josephus won't tell us about. They were the Edessans. So the Edessan monarchy were involved somehow in this sort of gospel story, because why were they there? Because, Edessa is up in northern Syria.
Sure.
Nowadays it's up in Anatolia, but in those days it was known as Syria, basically. Well, why were the combatants there? We know why King Aretas was there. He was there because his daughter had been sent home. His daughter had been spurned by the Judean king. But why were the Edessans down there? The only other thing that happened at this very time is that John the Baptist managed to be beheaded. It seems highly likely, therefore, that's why the Edessans came down to this battle. It seems highly likely that John the Baptist was involved with this Edessan monarchy. And that was the basis of my book, Jesus, the King of Edessa, because I link him up with this monarchy in the north of Syria. So we need this background knowledge because, of course, when we come onto Arthurian legend, we're going to be talking about various battles and events between important kings. And here we have stories about important kings. Now, you might not see the link at present, but you will when we start talking about King Arthur. The other thing, just very quickly, on the gospel side of the story, is what was the gospel story? Was it just a story about, carpenters and shepherds and poor people? Or was it a story about kings, empires, and the control of empires? I think it was the latter, and that's again what I've proven in my book, Jesus, King of Edessa, that this was an important story with important people about important events, but it's been rather covered up by Rome, who didn't want you to know what it was actually talking about. Now, one of the interesting proofs of that is the parable of the vineyard owner. A lot of these parables don't make a great deal of sense if you think about them. Again, if you read these parables quickly, you can sort of just understand them and say, yes, oh, okay, yes, it's a parable. But if you sort of look at the parable a little bit deeper, it doesn't sort of make any sense. And this is one of those that doesn't make any sense, the parable of the vineyard owner. And it says there was a lord who planted a vineyard, so he's a landowner. And he rented it out to a tenant and went to a far country. So he's an absentee landlord. And when the harvest came, he sent his servants to the tenant so he could receive his rent. But the tenant took his servants and he beat one and killed another and stoned another. So when the absentee landlord comes to the vineyard, what will he do to these tenants? Well, he will miserably destroy those wicked men and let his vineyard out to other tenants who will pay their rent on time. Now, that's that's a parable from the lips of Jesus. And you've got to say, okay, why is Jesus promoting the rights of absentee landlords?
Right.
To kill his tenants if they don't pay their rent. Where's the, Jesus, man of the people, in that parable?
Right.
It
Yeah.
doesn't make sense. People repeat these parables without thinking about them, but it doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't.
So how can we make sense of this? Why is Jesus lauding the rights of absentee landlords to get rent from their tenants? Well, I think, like many things in the New Testament story, the story is correct. It's our interpretation is wrong because we've been led down the wrong road by some small little changes to the story. And all we need to do to actually find out what it was talking about is we need to replace the tenant with Rome, and we need to replace the landlord with the Edessan king.
Okay.
And then we read it again, and it says, because remember, Edessans controlled all of Syria, and they controlled most of Judea in the late first century, from the AD 50s onwards.
Mm-hmm.
So in effect, they were the landlords. So we read it again, and it says there was an Edessan king who had lands in Judea, and he let it out to the Romans and went to a far country. He went back to Edessa. And when the harvest drew near, he sent his servants to the Romans so he might receive his rent
Mm-hmm.
for his lands. But the Romans took his servants and beat one and killed another and stoned another. So when the Edessan king of these lands comes down to Judea, what will he do to these wicked Romans? He will miserably destroy these wicked Romans, and he will let out his lands to another tenant who will pay their rent. Now you can see what the parable was talking about. It was a complaint that the Romans were on Edessan lands. They considered these to be their lands, but Rome was occupying all of the Near East, all of Judea and all of Syria. And these wicked Romans wouldn't pay their rent for being there.
Right.
Not only that, but they actually went to Edessa and said, we want rent from you. So this was the tenant asking for rent from the landlord. And that's what this story was all about. It was about a tax dispute, because there was, in real history, there was this tax dispute between the Edessans and the Romans. And that's what the gospel story is talking about. But you wouldn't know that if you just read the story very quickly.
Right.
And that's what we want to explore when we come on to Arthurian legend, because we have a problem with Arthurian legend. And do break in if you've got any questions. Just shout out.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by what you're saying, because I agree 100%, because any book, really, you have to take a real hard look at it, because I mean there's metaphors and parables and everything, and so you have to sort through all that stuff. And what you've done is incredible by being able to match all this stuff up.
Yeah, but you've got to read these stories with very open eyes, because if you have any prior beliefs about what this story is supposed to be about, you will never see the underlying story.
Right.
Because your beliefs will cloud your vision and you will not see it. Now, I come from a very open-minded background. I like to sort of call myself like a Gnostic atheist. So it's a Gnostic is someone who knows, whereas an agnostic is someone who doesn't know. And so I can view these stories with open eyes, because it doesn't really matter to me whether the story has changed a little bit. I don't have a dog in this fight very much. But the odd thing about my work is that I've proved that like 90%, 80-90% of the gospel story is correct.
That's cool.
Not quite in the way that people expect, like we've just seen with the parable. There is a change in the power and influence of the people involved.
Right.
So we're not talking about pauper princes of peace and carpenters. We're talking about important people, aristocrats and kings and things of that nature. And there's a slight change in the chronology, but apart from that, the story is the same.
When you
and
talk
it's amazing what you can do if you slightly change the story, how you can miss what it's really talking about.
When you talk about Christ being the one and only King, what's your definition of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, he was known as the King of Kings, so yes, but that was a fairly common title.
Right.
And the Edessan monarchs were titled very much the same. But important kings often called themselves the King of Kings.
Right.
So yeah, he wasn't the one and only, of course, but he was regarded in that fashion by many people because he was a very influential character. He was involved in this massive revolt against Rome, which is the subject of the Arthurian story, of course. So this is where we come into the Arthurian side of this. And as I say, there's a problem with Arthurian legend, a bit like Jesus being missing from the historical record. Nobody has ever found Jesus in the historical record properly.
Right.
Whereas I have, because I say he came from Edessa. We'll go through that later.
Sure.
But the King Arthur story is exactly the same. He's missing from the historical record. And Arthurian purists will say, no, we've got these texts, we've got these manuscripts, and they give us the story of King Arthur, but they don't. Unless you actually read the original manuscripts, you'll suddenly find that what people write about King Arthur is not actually often correct. So there's a lot of misinformation running around, especially if you're watching films or reading lay books, which
I was
don't
gonna
give
say,
you.
obviously his life was not like Camelot. I mean, we'll just leave it
Yeah.
at that.
Well, no,
Yeah.
it was, but not in the fashion that they portray.
Right. Okay.
Because they're looking for a fairy story. Basically, that's what Hollywood is all about. So a
Right.
Hollywood film is never going to give you the truth, but neither do many fairly deep investigations. They don't give you the truth either, so they gloss over some of this as well. So you really have to go into deep manuscript searching before you will find this, because he's missing from the historical record. So the earliest chronicler we get is Gildas, and he's 5th or 6th century. So he's right in the Dark Age time when King Arthur was supposed to be ruling Britain. And he never mentions King Arthur, which is odd. And then the Venerable Bede, he's 8th century. He writes a history of Britain, and he doesn't mention King Arthur either.
Is there still a search on, real quick? I don't want to interrupt, but is there still a search on for Arthur's grave? Because they don't even know where he's buried.
No, well, they won't. I will show you why they won't. No, nobody knows where he's buried because nobody has any evidence that he ever lived.
Right.
And people will say, oh, no, the manuscripts do mention him, because they have this idea from written history and even from Hollywood that there is mention of King Arthur. And then, of course, my response is, well, give me a quote from Gildas or Venerable Bede. And of course, that's probably the first time they've ever looked it up for real, and suddenly they can't find any mention of King Arthur. Nennius does the same. He's 9th century. Now, he mentions a Dux Bellorum, a warrior, a warrior lord. What do you call him? A warlord is what you would call him, a Dux Bellorum, known as Arthur, but he doesn't mention the King Arthur. There's no Camelot, there's no table, there's no knights, there's no Guinevere, there's no Lancelot, there's no real Arthurian story in any of this, even though he mentions this warrior called Arthur. What they're doing actually is, when they mention this warrior called Arthur, they're probably actually talking about Hercules, because when we come on to the next, when we come on to Geoffrey of Monmouth, the birth, conception and birth scene for King Arthur is actually the conception and birth of Hercules. So they're using Greek legend for the birth of King Arthur. So you can see how they're working mythology into real history, sort of thing. So yeah, Nennius, we're 9th century. Then we come to William of Malmesbury, and his first book, Chronicle of the English Kings, 12th century, 1125-ish, roughly. And he doesn't mention King Arthur again. He just mentions this Dux Bellorum, this warlord. Henry of Huntingdon, again, 1130, doesn't mention the King Arthur. So we're all the way up to the 12th century. The King Arthur guy was supposed to be 5th century or 6th century, Dark Age king. We've arrived all the way to the medieval period here in the 12th century, and we still have no King Arthur. He's missing for like 600 years, and we still don't have the story of King Arthur. And then
it reminds me, this whole thing reminds me of that pharaoh in Egypt. Was it a female pharaoh?
Hatshepsut.
Yeah, and they took everything's gone with her. They took off all this stuff. Yeah, because this is what this reminds me of.
Yeah, they did this quite a lot with people they didn't like.
Right.
Like the Jesus character, because obviously Jesus had his opposition as well as his supporters, and the opposition won that particular battle, and so they delete you from history.
Yeah.
The Edessans had the same problem. We've just looked at it. The Edessans were deleted from history.
Right.
Well, King Arthur has been deleted from history because nobody wanted you to know who this guy was.
Mm-hmm.
Because he is there, but it's not quite the story that people expect.
Mm-hmm.
So for 600 years, he's missing, and suddenly we get Geoffrey of Monmouth and Walter of Oxford. And they are 1135, so only 5 years after Henry Huntingdon. And suddenly we get the entire Arthurian story. All of a sudden, complete, except for there's no table and there's no Lancelot. But, pretty much other than that, it's the entire Arthurian story. Suddenly arrives for no good reason, with no backstory, with no history to it. It's suddenly there. And you have to ask yourself, why? How did that suddenly happen?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not even a Welsh sort of story. I mean, Geoffrey of Monmouth, supposed to have come from Monmouth, which is on the Welsh borders, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a Norman. He wasn't Welsh.
Mm-hmm.
And both Walter of Oxford and Geoffrey of Monmouth say that they got the story from Normandy and Brittany, northern France, because that's where Monmouth came from. He was this was during just after the Norman invasions, of course,
Mm-hmm.
for people who are not familiar with British history. So 1066, just like 60 odd years before,
right,
was the Norman invasion of Britain.
mm-hmm.
And so these Normans came over from northern France, and they took over the whole of sort of southern Britain initially, and pretty much actually all the way up to the Scottish borders eventually. And remember that the Normans were not French. The Normans were Vikings.
Yes.
These were red-headed Vikings. So William the Conqueror, who came over in 1066, he was a redhead because he was a Viking. And they took over Britain. So that's why Monmouth, Geoffrey of Monmouth, was a Norman on the Welsh borders between England and Wales. And it's from these two that we get this dramatic story. And they're both giving the same story. So Walter of Oxford is a bit more prosaic. It's just a chronicle of King Arthur. Whereas Geoffrey of Monmouth turns it into a very interesting sort of story, a little bit more dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
And his became the much more popular of the two stories, of course. So that is the King Arthur story, suddenly arrives. But
Mm-hmm.
other people were less than impressed. So again, the Arthurian purists will say, well, we've got the history of King Arthur. But only like 25 years after Monmouth and Oxford, we get William of Newburgh, who writes the History of English Affairs, which is a very good history of England, written in 1160. And he savages Geoffrey of Monmouth about his story about King Arthur, because he says it's a tissue of lies.
Mm-hmm.
So not everybody was on board with this Arthurian business by any means. So William of Newburgh says, and I'll quote here for readers and listeners, he says, only a person ignorant of ancient history can for a moment doubt how impertinently and impudently Monmouth falsifies the history in every respect. Whatever Geoffrey has written is a fiction, invented either by himself or by others, and promulgated either through an unchecked propensity to falsehood or a desire to please the Britons.
Mm-hmm.
For how could the elder historians, who were ever anxious to omit nothing remarkable, and even recorded trivial circumstances, pass by unnoticed so incomparable a man and such surpassing deeds as King Arthur?
Mm-hmm.
How could they, I repeat, by their silence, suppress King Arthur, a British monarch who was superior to Alexander the Great? And that's perfectly true. He's hit the nail on the head there. If we have this well-known, wealthy, influential, powerful monarch called King Arthur in Dark Age Britain. How on earth could you omit his story from all of the other chronicles that came before?
Right.
It's just not possible.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a problem with Arthurian legend. There was no Dark Age King Arthur. And he couldn't have been in the Dark Ages, the 5th, 6th century, because Monmouth says he was fighting the Romans. There were no Romans in Britain at that time. They left in about 400 AD.
Okay.
Because Rome was under attack. They were sort of retreating. The Romans had left Britain at that time. So we had this hiatus with no Romans, and we kept getting attacked in Britain by various people coming across the North Sea. And on 2 occasions, the Britons called to Rome, and they made appeals to Rome for help.
Mm-hmm.
And Rome would send a legion, because they didn't really have many people to spare at that time. And they would send a legion to help them out and then withdraw again. And then they got into trouble again, and they sent another legion, and they said, no, sorry, you're on your own. We're off. So by 405 AD, there were no Romans. So King Arthur could not have been fighting Romans in Britain.
Do
So
you think
again,
that? Oh, sorry to interrupt. Do you think that the Legend of King Arthur is really like 2 or 3 different kings or warriors put together?
no, he's one person,
Okay.
but he's not who you would expect him to be.
Okay. Okay.
And to get a clue about who he actually was, we need to look at the broader picture of who King Arthur is and the legends that were written about him. And the other odd thing, which people won't know about, is that King Arthur is a European character.
Okay.
So we get Arthurian legends from Germany, from Holland, from Italy, from Greece, from Scandinavia, from Scotland, from Italy. The only place we don't get any Arthurian legends from is from Britain. There are no chronicles of King Arthur from Britain all the way up until we get to Mallory with
Right.
Mort de Arthur.
Okay.
So we get manuscripts from Germany, Lancelot, Tristan, Eric and Wayne, Tristan again, another one, Daniel von Blumenthal, Parsifal, of course, the famous Parsifal from Wolfram von Eschenbach. From Holland, we get History de Van de Grael. We get Roman and Walwayn. And who do we get? Oh, Italy, we get Tristano. La Tavolta Ritonda Filippo, all sorts of them. These are all Arthurian manuscripts. And of course, we get all the French ones. We get Chrétien de Troyes with his Percival and Lancelot. And then the Vulgate cycle, which is mainly again from Normandy, from northern France, and so on. So this is looking more like a European story, a European history rather than the British history, because there are no early British manuscripts that mention King Arthur. And that's odd. And then we come on to an even odder thing, which is, where is the earliest sculpture of King Arthur? Now, that's an interesting little problem. So where can we find the very early, and this is quite early, this goes back to the Norman era. This is 12th century, so probably about 1180s or so. Very, very early sculpture of King Arthur and the story of King Arthur with Guinevere and Mordred and everything else. So where would that be? Tricky. You know, are we talking about Glastonbury, Tintagel, Camelodunum, you know, the traditional places where we think King Arthur came from? No, the answer is, if I do a quick screen share, so I'll share screen. select a window. I'll select that window and share. Now that should come up, hopefully.
I see it. And now let me click over there.
Good. So yes, this is the earliest
There we go.
image of King Arthur we have. This is all the knights of the Round Table here besieging the castle at the top. You can see the castle at the top. In the castle is Guinevere, although she's called Wenderley here, but you can hear the name Guinevere in that. And Mordred in the castle. And you've got all the knights because their names are above them, so we know they're all the knights. Can you see my cursor going round and round?
No.
Okay. On the left, second from the bottom, is King Arthur.
Okay.
And then the rest of them are the knights of the Round Table.
Oh, that's cool.
Now, yeah, sorry.
That's really cool.
Yeah. But where is this? This is on Modena Cathedral in Italy.
Interesting.
So the earliest sculpture we have of King Arthur comes from Italy, which is not where you would expect it to come from.
No, absolutely not.
So yeah, just zooming in, we can zoom in on King Arthur. Oh, let me make that a bit bigger. There we go. That's King Arthur.
Oh, that's cool.
Sitting on his horse. He's the only one that doesn't have chain mail on.
Right.
And all of the knights, you might have been able to see it on the previous picture. All the knights are in Norman armor, of course, with chain mail and the kite shields and so on. It's all depicted correctly in the Norman fashion because this was the Norman era. And then here at the top here's the castle that we were looking at before. And Guinevere's on the left, sort of weeping, I think, in the castle by the looks of it. And she's called Winlogi. You can see that over her head. And the other guy is Marduk. That's King Arthur's son. So yeah, that's interesting. That's where Arthurian legend comes from. And we can do this again because oh no, we didn't want that one.
Oh yeah.
We wanted that one. This is the second sculpture of King Arthur, and it's exactly the same. It's actually got a bit more detail on this one. It's the same as the one we've just seen. Again, it's very early. It's the 1180s, so it's 12th century with Norman knights. And this one is on the cathedral at Bari in southern Italy. Ah, okay.
So really, so really, it's like you say, he's more European as opposed to British.
Yeah, completely. Okay. We don't get any of this from Britain, so it's
right.
all from Italy. And here's the third one, and you can see it says Rex Arthurus, King Arthur. This is a nice mosaic. I'm not sure what he's actually riding because it's got cloven hoofs, whatever he's riding. So he's not riding a horse. He's riding, I don't know, something like an antelope or something. I don't know why Arthur would be.
We just found the jackalope, kids. No, I'm kidding.
Because the same mosaic has a horse with proper hooves on it. So for some reason they gave this one cloven hooves. But anyway, this is King Arthur. And where's this? This is in Otranto. Otranto is in southern Italy. And again, this is very early. This is 12th century. So, yeah, King Arthur is not exactly a British hero. And the reason for this, let me just stop share. Okay. Where do I do that? Down the bottom here, stop share.
Yeah. Okay, we're back.
Okay, so...
That works. It's the first time I've ever done that.
Yeah.
That's pretty slick.
Straight back again.
Right on, okay.
So yeah, we have a problem with the Arthurian story, and the solution to this story, although it's a bit of a challenge for some people if they're Arthurian purists, and bit of a challenge for people if they are fundamentalist Christians, but there we go. The answer to this is the date that this all happens. So we're talking about 12th century. We're talking about Geoffrey of Monmouth in 1135 was when he wrote his story. History of the no, what was his called? It was the History of the Kings of Britain. Was Geoffrey of Monmouth, and so 1135. That is just 6 years after the formation of the Knights Templar.
Okay.
This was a Knights Templar story because a funny thing happened on the way to the Crusades. I've been talking about Jesus might have been associated with Edessa in northern Syria.
Right.
Well, the history of the Crusades is that in 1096, Count Baldwin of Boulogne was the leader of the first crusade, and they set off and they went across Europe through Constantinople, through Anatolia, and they got to the sort of northeastern part of the Mediterranean, where they're supposed to head south down towards Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they didn't. The first crusade did not go to Jerusalem. The first crusade carried on heading east, and it went across the Euphrates, and it went to Edessa. So the first city that was liberated from Islamic control in 1098
Mm-hmm.
was Edessa.
Wow.
And you've got to wonder, what on earth were they doing in Edessa? And remember, I didn't know anything about this when I was writing my Jesus King of Edessa. I'd never heard of because I wasn't researching Arthurian legend at that time. So I didn't know anything about this. So I wrote this big, long story, 600-page book about Jesus coming from Edessa. And then I find out that the first crusade doesn't go to Jerusalem, it goes to Edessa. Why would they do that? Well, the obvious answer, I think, from my point of view, is that they knew that they might find something interesting in Edessa. If they had known something about the story which I've been writing about,
Mm-hmm.
Jesus King of Edessa, then where are you going to go if you want information about the gospel story? Are you going to go to Jerusalem, or are you going to go to the source, potential source
Right.
of that information, which is Edessa?
Right.
And if you're going to want anything like, I don't know, artifacts, treasures, history, genealogies, anything of that nature, you're going to go to Edessa. And of course, what did they do as soon as they went to Edessa? They set up the Knights Templar. So the Knights Templar were set up in 1119, and they were ratified by the church in 1129.
Mm-hmm.
And the Knights Templar were obviously set up to maintain secrets. That was the whole point of the Knights Templar. It was an initiatory organization where the secrets were held at the top, and you're not going to find out about any of the secrets of the Knights Templar. They didn't write them down. They were held within the organization. And 6 years after they were set up and ratified, then we have Arthurian legend.
Interesting.
And I think that is causal. So that's not a coincidence. That was done on purpose. Because what would happen if they found an interesting story in Edessa? Because what I think they found is sort of like they found my book, as it were, Jesus King of Edessa. They found that story. Or they might have found the history of the kings of Judea by Justus of Tiberias.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we know that book existed because Josephus Flavius talks about it, and he hates it because he says it's a tissue of lies. It's nothing to do with the real history. So what he's saying is this is a history of Judea that disagrees with what Josephus Flavius was saying.
Okay.
And so he hates this book and he writes about it. But that book has gone missing. We don't have that book. It would be very nice to see the opposite view to what Josephus is telling us. But we don't have that book. But what if they had found that book, maybe, in Edessa? That would be heretical It would be very inflammatory. It's not the sort of history you could write about in the medieval era. Remember, my book is saying that Jesus was a real king.
Right.
Well, that's heretical for a start. That he didn't die in AD 30, he died in AD 70. Or rather, he was crucified in AD 70, but survived, rather like the gospel story says, but it was 40 years later. And of course, that's exactly what Arthurian legend says. We have this wonderful, because this is where we start getting on to, what is Arthurian legend? Because Arthurian legend's got nothing to do with King Arthur. It's a strange old, it's a strange book. The most of this information comes from the later manuscripts, not from Geoffrey of Monmouth. So we get things like the Vulgate cycle, which Arthurian researchers normally don't touch because it's like 10 volumes, 4,000 pages of impenetrable Arthurian material. So a lot of people skip over it. But if you're going to find out anything that's happening, you read these odd manuscripts like the Vulgate cycle, like High History of the Holy Grail, things of that nature. And they give us a rather different story. And one of the stories they give is this very same 40-year gap. So they're talking about Joseph of Arimathea. Remember, one of the heroes of Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea. So we're talking 1st century, we're talking Judea for some reason. Anyway, Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus down from the cross. Well, it has to say that in AD 30 because that's the standard classical date. But then he is sent to jail by the Romans, so he's put in jail. And he goes to sleep for 3 days and he wakes up 40 years later. And he hasn't aged, he's the same age. So 40 years have just skipped by so that Joseph of Arimathea can become a knight working for Emperor Vespasian in AD 70. Now that's interesting. So they have the same 40-year gap here that I've already claimed, because I wrote about this 40-year gap back in 1997. And Arthurian legend has the same gap because there is a dislocation within the gospel story. We'll talk about this when we come on to Edessa in another talk sometime.
Sure.
But what it's indicating, very strongly indicating, is because we get the same story from Josephus Flavius. Josephus Flavius was an army commander working for the Jewish authorities, but then he changed sides and started working for the Romans. And so after the Jewish revolt, he was coming back from Tekoa, which is Herodium, and he saw the 3 leaders of the Jewish revolt being crucified. And they were his former compatriots. So he went to the governor and he got permission to take them down early. So they were taken down early. 2 of them died and 1 of them survived. Familiar story? And this was Josephus Flavius. And it's quite clear from Arthurian legend that Joseph of Arimathea was Josephus Flavius. Because the surname of Josephus Flavius was Matthias. And they call him Bar-Mathari is what they call him in Arthurian legend. Bar-Matthias, son of Matthias, which is exactly what Josephus Flavius was. So they are linking Joseph of Arimathea, because of course nobody knows who this Joseph of Arimathea is. He just pops into the story at the end of the Gospels. And you're supposed to know who he is because he's not introduced, and takes Jesus down from the cross. Well, Arthurian legend is saying that that person was Josephus Flavius, because that is exactly what Josephus Flavius does in his own books. He takes down the leaders of the Jewish revolt from the cross, and 1 of them survives. It's the same story. So you can get what Arthurian legend is talking about, perhaps. This is okay. This is a huge. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, how long did it take you to get through all this to figure all this out? I mean,
30 years.
This is a lot of information. I have visions of you sitting at this desk with like books stacked everywhere, and you're cross-referencing.
Oh yes, yeah, very much so. There's a very well-known painting of Saul, I think it is,
Mm-hmm.
covered with books all over his desk. Well, yeah, that was me.
Sorry to interrupt. I just had this. I was like, wow.
Yeah, this was very intense. I did nothing but research this book for 2 years,
Wow.
working every day at it, doing nothing else. But it was valuable. A lot of information dropped out of this story, and here is where we come on to the heresies of Arthurian legend. And again, standard researchers will not tell you this because they've never read it, because they never bothered to read the Vulgate Cycle or High History and various other manuscripts. And so they won't know this. But if we delve into High History, it's called High History of the Holy Grail.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know who wrote it, but it was influential because it was the basis of Chrétien's Percival,
Mm-hmm.
which is quite a famous manuscript, and it was the basis of Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal.
Mm-hmm.
They're all based on this high history. But high history is a bit of a heretical sort of manuscript. I mean, it says that King Arthur was the most evil king who had ever been born, which is a slight reversal of what we expect of Arthurian legend.
Right.
But it says things that are rather odd, like it says, and these are a couple of quotes here. He says, Josephus, the good clerk, tells us the good knight, who is Percival, had come, of whom you shall hear his name presently.
Mm-hmm.
That's from High History. And this Josephus is the son of Joseph of Arimathea. Now that's odd, because Josephus is writing about the good knight, Percival, Sir Percival, one of the knights of the Round Table. And then it goes on and it says, hear you the history of the most holy vessel that is called the Grail. Josephus has written this in remembrance by annunciation of the voice of an angel, so that the truth might be known. So again, this story is being written by Josephus.
Mm-hmm.
And then it says, good knight, who's Percival, was of the lineage of Joseph of Arimathea, or Abaramasi, as they call him, Arimathea. So Percival was of the lineage of Joseph of Arimathea, and this Joseph was Percival's mother's uncle, who had been a soldier for Pilate for 7 years. Some of the manuscripts say a soldier of Vespasian. Of this lineage was the good knight, for whose sake this high history was written. Igles was his mother's name, and King Fisherman was his uncle. And the king of the lower folk was called King Peles. And the head of his lineage on his father's side was called Nicodemus, the Nicodemus from the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so all of this is very interesting, and it says the same in History of the Holy Grail from the Vulgate Cycle as well. So, what it's saying here is that Percival was the nephew of Joseph of Arimathea. Okay, so Percival is a Arthurian knight of the Round Table, and he's a nephew of Joseph of Arimathea, who's a first century character, as we all know, who took Jesus down from the cross. And Arthurian legend says was Josephus Flavius. So it's plainly saying that Sir Percival, was a first century character in Judea. Nothing to do with Britain.
Right.
And then it goes on and it says, King Hermit came from the forest and could not find his nephew, who is Percival. So he mounted a white mule that he had there. The mule had a star on her forehead in the shape of a red cross. Josephus, the good clerk, tells us that this same mule belonged to Joseph of Arimathea when he was a soldier working for Pilate.
Hmm.
So King Hermit, so we've got two kings here. We've got King Hermit and King Pelles, who are both Arthurian kings, who are, part of the lineage of the Arthurian story.
Right.
And they have a mule that belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. So either we have a 500-year-old mule, or we're
Right.
talking about the first century again.
Right.
And that's a problem. And of course, this has been known, although you won't know it from standard history that you read of King Arthur. But it has been known. This has been talked about for 100 years. So William Neitz, he's American, I think, professor from 1903. So we're going back, more than a century.
Right.
And he's considered to be the father of Arthurian research. People go back to Neitz because he knows the story.
Mm-hmm.
And Neitz says of these stories and of the Vulgate cycle, he says the role of Josephus is of greater importance in our work than that of Joseph. It is to Josephus to whom we owe the tale, and he's known as the good clerk and the good hermit.
Mm-hmm.
Twice the text calls him simply Joseph, and twice he's called Josephus. Nevertheless, it is now generally supposed that the confusion of these two Josephs, Joseph of Arimathea and Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian, gave rise to the legend of Joseph and his son Josephus, as mentioned above. So he's admitting here that they're talking about Josephus Flavius.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this Josephus is known as the good scribe, who's a witness to history. Now, who was the good scribe, the good author, who was a witness to history? It's Josephus Flavius. And he was the good knight because Josephus Flavius was a knight working for the Judeans before he became a knight working for the Romans. So he was all of these things. And then Ernst Brugger, again, he's an early Arthurian historian, says the same thing. So Brugger says, because even if Josephus Flavius was well known as a historian and even much respected and held as a Christian historian, it remains striking that he could record events from British history that occurred many centuries after his death.
Mm-hmm.
I think these oddities are only the result of a confusion. So people have addressed the problems that exist within Arthurian legend. Mm-hmm. That Arthurian legend claims that the original author of Arthurian legend was Josephus Flavius, the first century Judean historian. And that's a problem for anyone who's a Arthurian fundamentalist. Mm-hmm. Because we've just turned the story upside down.
Right.
It's not talking about Britain. Mm-hmm. It's talking about the Near East. It's not talking about the Dark Ages. It's talking about the first century. So who is the Arthurian character who was in the first century fighting the Romans, as we discussed at the beginning of this talk,
right?
Who's well known as a king, who had a great court and all of the knights, 12 knights of the round Last Supper table. Mm-hmm. That character is the Jesus character.
Absolutely.
And that is a problem for most people to understand. But we can get an idea of what they're talking about if I do a little screen share.
Yes.
There we go.
We're back, sports fans.
I can't hear you now. You're muted for some reason.
I'm muted? Wow, okay. I wonder what's going on with that.
Shall I continue? I can't hear you at present.
Yes, go ahead. Just continue.
You'll have to give me a thumbs up if I shall continue.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, right. So here is we have some of the evidence that points in this direction. So we're another thing that people don't know about is that the primary symbol of early Judaism was the zodiac. So, and this is Nazarene Judaism, the Judaism of King Jesus, because he was said to be a Nazarene. And their primary symbol was actually the zodiac, which is very strange because most people don't know that. So this is the Hamat Tavera zodiac. This is on the Sea of Galilee at Tiberias, and it's in a synagogue. So this is a Judaic zodiac. You can see it's all in Aramaic, but it's the standard zodiac, the same as we have today. And incongruously, we get in the center, we get Helios, the sun god, which is highly heretical. You shouldn't have this in a synagogue. You weren't allowed any graven images, let alone a symbol of a Greek sun god being in the middle of a zodiac. But do note that the Helios character in the center is holding a sort of blue spherical Earth in his gravitational grasp, so that we know that the heliocentric model of the solar system was known. This is a first century zodiac. So, and this zodiac was owned by Jesus. According to Josephus Flavius, this was owned by Jesus of Gamala Cephius. And Jesus of Gamala was the rebel leader of 600 rebel fishermen. Now that's interesting as well. But anyway, we'll come on to that later. If we can have a quick look in more detail at this one. So in here, I'll just expand this a little bit. You can see on the Earth, it's spherical because it's lit on one side and it's darker on the other. And the lines of latitude and longitude are curved, indicating this is a sphere. So yeah, this is the heliocentric model of the solar system. But what else is this? This is a kingly character, Helios, surrounded by 12 constellations, 12 disciple constellations. So from Arthurian legend, we have the story that there were 3 tables that were copies of each other. The first table was the round table, Last Supper table of Jesus, which was a round table. It wasn't as portrayed by Leonardo da Vinci. It was a round table with Jesus and the 12 disciples. And I think it was, of course, based upon this design. It was based upon the zodiac. The second table was the table of Joseph of Arimathea, and he had a round table with 12 of his disciples. And then the third round table was the round table of King Arthur and his 12 knights. And they were all copies of each other. So the round table of King Arthur was the same as the Last Supper table because they were related stories. And what I think they were talking about is this, that the round table was a zodiac. And so the Jesus type character should not be, because if we go down to a well-known, before we get there, we've got quite a few of these. This is not the only zodiac. This is another zodiac from Galilee. This is the Sepphoris zodiac. You can see it's another very well drawn Judaic and Greek sort of zodiac with Helios in the center again and the 12 constellations. And this is a Christian one. This is from, again, Sea of Galilee, Bet Shean, just on the south of the Sea of Galilee. And this is in a Christian monastery. So this is a Christian one, but they've changed the signs of the zodiac into months of the year.
Mm-hmm.
But in the center, if you look in the center, we see the sun and the moon as being the two central characters. Now, who was the king and the queen in this early era surrounded by 12 disciples? This was the Jesus character, Jesus and Mary Magdalene, surrounded by 12 disciples. That's what it's indicating here. And again, this is based upon the zodiac. And so we have from British history, we have this one. Let's just increase that a little bit. This is from Winchester, and this is very old. This is from Edward I. So we're talking 800 years old, this table. And it's supposed to be a copy of the Arthurian table because Arthurian legend was very influential in this early era. And the king on this one was redrawn as Henry VIII. So that's Henry VIII on the top there. And again, this was based upon a zodiac. But they've got the king character in the wrong position because they should have a table like this one. This comes from a Hollywood film. And this should be what the table looks like. It should be a table with a hole in the center. Because the king character, the sun character, should be sitting at the center of the zodiac, at the center of the table.
Sure.
And that gives us an idea of how we got this name for this Arthurian character. Because if we look at a zodiac, so if we go back to this one and have a look at a zodiac, let's zoom that down a little bit. No, that's probably not the best image. Let's have another look. Oh, here's a zodiac. Let's have a look at that one. If you have a zodiac, you can either sit in the heavens above looking down at the solar system, and so you'll see the sun at the center, surrounded by all the constellations that go around the ecliptic. That's what they're showing in the Hamat Tavera zodiac, this one, with the sun in the center, surrounded by the signs of the zodiac. So you can either have that portrayal, or you can have someone, an observer, sitting on the earth, looking up at the heavens above you, with the zodiac all around you, the ecliptic all around you, and above you, in the heavens above, are the polar stars, the polar constellations. And of course, the main polar constellation in the north is Ursa Major, which is the Great Bear. And of course, King Arthur is named after the Great Bear. That's where his name comes from. So for a zodiac, you can either have the sun character in the middle, the Son of God, the Jesus character, as we've seen, the Jesus and Mary character, or you can have Ursa Major, the Great Bear, in the center. And therefore, we have a direct comparison between the Jesus character and the Arthur character, because these are both the characters who sit at the center of a zodiac. Right. And that is what they were trying to portray when they were talking about King Arthur. So if I stop sharing there, yes, what we're saying here is that Arthurian legend was crafted to record the secular history of the Gospels, so the secular Jesus character and his Knights of the Round Table, because if he was a prince and a king of Edessa, he would have had his own court with his own knights, as it were, of the Round Table. And what else was I going to talk about here? we could actually talk a little bit about the Holy Grail. So the other thing that comes up within Arthurian legend is the Holy Grail, which, if we read Wolfram von Eschenbach, the Holy Grail is, well, it has several. I'm just bringing up another thing. There we go. The Holy Grail has several manifestations. It's sort of multifaceted. And so on the base of the Holy Grail, we know it as a chalice, as the cup that held the blood of Jesus, the cup that was held by Joseph of Arimathea that collected the blood of Jesus. So it's a grail, a dish, something to do with blood, and therefore something maybe to do with bloodlines.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not just talking about a cup, we're talking about a cup that holds a bloodline. And on the secondary facet of this Holy Grail, from Arthurian legend, we get an indication that it's connected to a royal family, that it's connected to a bloodline. And we get this from Wolfram von Eschenbach. And he has this story about the Knights of the Round Table, and they're initiating a new knight to the Round Table who's Firefitz, who was the knight who came from the East. Yes, while we're just talking about that, Parsifal, the work by Wolfram von Eschenbach, again is another of these interesting texts in that it starts its story just where you would expect it to start Arthurian legend. So it starts the story in Mesopotamia with the story of Gumuret, who was the father of Percival, who was working for a king of Mesopotamia. Again, we see that this story is not really connected to Britain at all. Anyway, the offspring of this union in Mesopotamia was Firefitz, who was a half caste, I suppose in the old days you would call it, knight of the Round Table, and he's being introduced to the Round Table, and they're going to show him the Grail. And so this princess comes before them, bearing a green cloth on her arm. And the knights say to Firefitz, "Can you see the Grail?" And he's looking around and he's trying to search for something that might be recognizable as the Grail, and he can't find anything. And he says, "Well, no, I can't see the Grail," which is a good indication, again, that you need to know what the story is talking about before you can make sense of it. So poor old Firefitz can't make any sense of the story whatsoever. And he says, "No, I can't see the Grail." And of course, all of the other knights fall about laughing because the Grail is the princess.
Mm-hmm.
So the Grail is not only a dish, it's also a bloodline. And of course, the princess holds the bloodline. So the Grail is her womb. So that's the second part of the Grail. And then the Grail had to be tended by a priesthood who would venerate the Grail. And we can come on to that into a minute, because they were the eunuch priests of Galilee. They were known as the Galli, or the Galileans, and we'll come on to that in a minute. And they were the keepers of the Grail. The keepers, well, the final manifestation of this Grail comes from Wolfram von Eschenbach. And he says that the Grail was a holy stone, a sacred stone. And so the keepers of the Grail were the keepers of the stone. And that's why, of course, the primary disciple to Jesus was Simon, who had the title of Peter Kephas, meaning the stone. So Simon was the keeper of the stone. And this was the sacred stone. And in Egypt, it has a long history, this stone. This was the sacred stone of Egypt. So if I quickly do a screen share, if it'll allow me to do that. Share screen and window and share. So that should be coming up.
Yeah.
And it should be there now. There we go. So yeah, this is the sacred stone of Egypt. This was known as the Benben. And it was like a pyramidion that used to be, well, some said it used to be on the top of the Great Pyramid, but it was known for being on an obelisk at Heliopolis. And it was a sort of pyramidion. It was a small pyramid, a conical stone upon which the phoenix used to stand. And you can see the phoenix standing on the Benben here. And the phoenix is a sun symbol. You can see the sunburst. Oh dear, it's just dropped off my screen. Let me get it back. There we go. You can see the sunburst around the head of the phoenix there.
Right.
But this stone went on a bit of a tour. And it went over to Greece, where it became the omphalos stone of Delphi. So this is the omphalos at Delphi. Now, this is not the original, of course.
Right.
This is just a copy. And again, you can see it's a conical stone that is supposed to be a meteorite. So that's why it was conical. It was supposed to be a fiery meteorite that had come in from the heavens above. That's why it was connected with the phoenix, because the phoenix was the fiery bird. It was a piece of the sun that had broken off from the sun and fallen to earth in a big fiery ball. And that's part of the reason why it was supposed to be sacred. So this was the sacred stone, but the sacred stone went across to Persia, or Parthia as it was known, in the centuries just BC. It probably went actually with Alexander the Great. And so here it is with Apollo here just sitting on the top of it. And sometimes it has this netting across it for some reason. We're not sure what this netting is all about. But here is the omphalos when it went to Persia. And it was revered over there because it's on a lot of their coinage. There's a lot of these coins from Persia. And then it came back to Edessa. We're talking about Edessa again. And here it is in Edessa. Now, in Edessa, it was a bit strange because they say it's a cubic Bethel or sacred stone. But I don't think it was cubic at all. You can see there's a cube there inside a temple with little legs on the bottom of it. And on the second one, you can see a cube in a temple that if you squint, you can probably see a wheel at the bottom of it. So it's sitting on like a cart or something. Well, I don't think this is the stone. I think this is the Beth El. This is the house of God, they call it, a Beth El. And it's a very small house of God. It's the Ark of the Covenant. So it's a box that holds the sacred stone. Let's zoom out a little bit. So it's a box that holds the stone, and that is known as a Beth El. And I think I think that the stone was inside the box because, well, I mean, if you read the Old Testament, the Ark of the Covenant held two stones which were written on by the hand of God. So it's the same sort of story in a way. It's beginning to jump all over the place for some reason. Let's get it back. Oh dear, stop jumping. So I think that is the box that held the omphalos stone. And it was a sacred stone inside the box, but it didn't stay there. It went down a little bit further, and eventually in the 2nd century, so we're talking 1st century, 2nd century here, the stone was in Edessa, and then it went down to Syria, a little bit further south, and this is the stone in Syria. And again, we can see it's a conical stone inside a temple, and you can see it's embossed with the symbol of the phoenix. You've got 2 wings to the left and right. In the center is the body and the tail, and then you can see 2 legs at the bottom and the head at the top. That is the phoenix. So it's embossed again with the image of the phoenix.
Fascinating.
Now, down in Syria, it was known as the El Gabal, which means the mountain of God. So Ella and Gabal, Gabal meaning hill, and Ella being the Aramaic for God. Sometimes it was called the Helio Gabal, using the Greek name Helios. So it was, again, it was like a sun symbol. And this was the sacred stone, which I think was held by Jesus and Peter when it was in Edessa. But then it went to Rome, because one of these princes of this region of Syria, so here it's in Syria, just south of Damascus, at a place called Homs and Hammer, which was known as Emesa in those days. So we had 2 city-states. One was called Edessa, and the other was called Emesa. And then it was taken by one of the princes of this principality, who became the emperor of Rome. So this is the mad Elagabalus. This is Elagabalus. And this is a gold coin from Rome of the Elagabal when it was taken to Rome. Let's have a better look at that. There we go. That's a better version. So this is the Elagabal when it was in Rome. And again, you can see it's a conical stone, and you can see it's embossed with the image of the phoenix on the side of it. And it's in a chariot, being a quadriga chariot, no less, a 4-horse chariot being taken around Rome. And Elagabalus was, he's not a very well-known emperor of Rome. We're talking about 220 AD, something like that. And Elagabalus was the mad Syrian emperor who was a eunuch. He castrated himself because the priests of this stone had to be eunuchs.
Wow.
They had to be castrated. And so he castrated himself, which they didn't like in Rome because it was actually illegal in Rome. You're not supposed to do this. So he wasn't very well liked in Rome. And so he was murdered after only about 4 or 5 years. And then the stone goes missing from history.
Wow.
And so we lost it, and we don't know where it is. And lots of people have claimed to have had it. It's even claimed to be up in Scotland as the Stone of Scone, you've probably heard of in Scottish history.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be this stone. But of course, there's no evidence that it is in Scotland at all. It's a bit of a topic now because we're just having the coronation of Charlie Boy. He's going to become the new King of England, well, King of Britain, I suppose I better say.
Yes.
And this was the stone that they're supposed to sit on during the coronation. It's the Stone of Scone. But of course, the Stone of Scone that was brought to Westminster Abbey by Edward I was not this stone. What they said they did is that Edward I demanded this stone because he knew they had it in Scotland, and they roughed up a lump of sandstone and gave him a piece of sandstone instead. And that's the piece of sandstone that's been in the coronation throne in Westminster Abbey for 800 years or whatever it was, until the Scots took it back again in the 1970s. I think they ran off with it in the 1970s. So I don't know what they're going to do with that, whether they're going to bring it down from Scotland again just for the ceremony or not. I don't know. We'll see. So that'll be interesting. So this stone is still a part of modern sort of history. You know, we're still talking about this stone even today. And I was a little bit amazed because it appeared in a film. I was sitting in a cinema and I was watching a Bond film, James Bond. I think it was Skyfall, if I remember correctly. Not quite sure. And the heroes were running around North Africa, and they ended up in this meteorite crater. And they were taken by the terrible baddie. They were taken by this guy to this planetarium. And for no apparent reason, because it didn't seem to have any connection with the rest of the story, they took James Bond and his sidekick, his girlfriend, and they showed him the Elagabal.
Wow.
And here it is in a Bond film. for absolutely no good reason whatsoever. This is the Elagabal, the sacred stone that's been running around for the last 3,500 years, from Egypt to Greece to Persia to Edessa to Emesa to Rome to maybe Scotland. We don't know because we don't have any proof. But here it is in a James Bond film. And you can see it's a meteorite, and it's introduced in the film as being a meteorite. And the baddie in the film gives this very strange speech about this being the oldest stone in the universe and things like this, and how important and how lonely this stone is. And it had no connection with the rest of the film whatsoever. So I don't know what this speech was all about. But here is, if anyone wants to know what the sacred stone is, this is what it would look like if we actually had it.
Wow.
The original Elagabal. So there we go.
This is just so fascinating to me. I mean, I'm in awe of the research you've done. You know, because it's incredible.
Yeah, and it's amazing how it all ties in, because you've got to remember, I didn't know anything about this.
Right.
So when I started writing my book about Edessa, I had never heard of Edessa.
Right.
And so the book was actually about Queen Helena. It was nothing to do with Edessa, because I'd never heard of the place. And then during the research, this place called Edessa came up on my radar, and suddenly that fitted into the story so well that it had to be a part of the story. And so the book changed and it became Jesus, King of Edessa. And then, you know, things like this sacred stone I'd never heard of before. And suddenly, you know, you start researching it and it fits into the story so well, right, with, you know, Peter being the stone, Peter Kephas, the primary disciple of Jesus. And it fits in so well with that stone. And then the story of Jesus fits in so well because the Galilee priests who looked after these stone were all eunuchs, as we were saying before. And then you go to Acts of the Apostles within the Gospels, and you suddenly find that Jesus asked for his disciples to castrate themselves.
Wow. And
again, people won't know that because, of course, the priesthood are not going to tell you that. So unless you've actually read the entire Gospels yourself, you're not going to know this. So this comes from Matthew 19, verses 11 and 12. And Jesus said, "All men cannot receive this saying, except those to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs which were born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men. But there are some eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it." It's a clear request by Jesus for his disciples to castrate themselves. And the only reason you would want to do that is if you wanted to become a Galilee priest, because the priests of the stone were known as the Galli or the Galileans, and they had to be eunuchs. They had to be castrated. And remember that Jesus and Peter were both called Galileans. So it's saying that Peter was a Galilean. He was a eunuch. And Jesus eventually was a eunuch. And this was a part of first century history. We have this from Lucian. In fact, we have it from quite a few authors. But Lucian says of the galley, he says, on these days, men become the galley priests. For while some are playing flutes and performing rites, a frenzy comes on at some of them, and he throws off his clothes and rushes to the center with a great shout. And he takes up a sword and immediately castrates himself. And then he rushes through the city holding his testicles in his hands. And he takes female clothing and women's adornment from whichever house he throws the testicles into.
Huh.
That was the festival at which the galley actually became the galley, that became the eunuch priests. And then they were involved in the Jewish revolt. So Josephus Flavius, again giving real history here. So, most of what Josephus Flavius actually says is normally historical. It's normally true. And he says the Galileans indulged themselves in feminine wantonness. Remember that Jesus was a Galilean. They decked their hair and put on women's garments and smeared their faces with ointments that they might appear very comely. They had paints under their eyes and imitated not only the ornaments but also the lusts of women. But while their faces looked like faces of women, they killed with their right hands, and while their gait was effeminate, they attacked men and became warriors, and drew their swords from under their finely decked dresses and ran everybody through that they alighted upon. Now, so the Galileans dressed as women because they were eunuch priests, and people will say, well, what on earth does that have to do with Christianity? Well, they still do that today. And people won't, they'll throw up their arms in horror and say, no, that's not true. But if we do a quick screen share, now that should be coming across to you as a screen share, hopefully.
Right there. Yeah.
So if I run up to here, we should see a cardinal.
Yes.
And what's he doing? He's wearing a red dress.
Right.
And of course, Sir Galahad, who was also a galley, that's where he gets his title from. He was a galley priest, Sir Galahad. He was known as the Red Knight. And so, of course, Sir Galahad would have worn a red dress. And they still do it today. This is the Catholic Church. If you go to Rome, the cardinals still wear red dresses and nice frilly petticoats. They are still doing exactly the same as in the first century, according to Josephus, according to Lucian, according to the Gospels, and according to Arthurian legend. They're still doing the same thing today. So, yeah, this is an ancient history that has flowed down through the millennia. And it's flowed down in various aspects that we don't realize what it's talking about, like Arthurian legend, because it's so heretical.
Right.
You can imagine someone talking about this in the Middle Ages, in the 12th, 13th century. You would be slow roasted over a fire for this sort of heresy. And so you could not talk about it openly. The only way you could talk about this is if you crafted this story in such a fashion that you hid the basis of the story. And they hid the basis of the story in Arthurian legend. But they were always doing this. There's loads of these stories going around that you won't realize are actually telling a story unless someone has introduced you to that little heresy, that little story. I mean, a classic one is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. What's all that about? It's actually a story about the movements of the heavens. But you would never understand it if you just look on the surface and see Snow White as being a fairy tale, because it's not. Snow White is the Snow White moon. That is who she is, and the wicked wicked witch is the Milky Way, and the wicked witch doesn't like Snow White because she is much brighter than the Milky Way. And so she gives Snow White a corset. And she puts the corset on Snow White and pulls it tighter and tighter. So she gets thinner and thinner, which is what the moon does as it goes through the sky. It gets thinner and thinner as it gets up to the new moon. And then, of course, when we get to the new moon, the moon dies. It's dead. It's black, just like Snow White dies. But at the new moon, the moon can be kissed by the sun, because these solar eclipses only happen at the new moon, when the moon kisses the sun in a solar eclipse. And so they kiss each other and then they merge, and they happen to be exactly the same size, which must have been very mysterious in the ancient world, that the moon and the sun are exactly the same size, and they cover each other, and they are in flagrante delicto. This is the sacred marriage in the heavens above. So they kiss each other, just as the prince, the solar prince, kisses Snow White. And then she comes back to life, which is exactly what the moon does. Oh, sorry, I forgot at the start of this that Snow White is followed by the 7 dwarfs.
Right.
And of course, that's exactly what happens in the heavens above. The moon is followed by the 7 planets,
right,
which follow in a big long line along the ecliptic following the moon. They are the 7 dwarfs, the smaller celestial bodies in the heavens above. So after the eclipse, the moon comes back to life again. The new moon is over and we get the new waxing moon. Is it waxing or waning? Yeah, it's waxing, isn't it? When it gets bigger, it's waxing. When it gets smaller, it's waning. So the Snow White story is a story of the movements of the heavenly bodies in the solar system. But you would never know that if you just read it as being a fairy tale.
Right.
So you can see how this information can be held in plain sight. You don't have to hide it. It's out there. Fairy tale of Snow White has been out there for hundreds of years. It came from the Brothers Grimm, didn't it? It's a Grimm's fairy tale.
Right.
And they were writing 200-300 years ago. I forget when the Brothers Grimm were around, but it's a long time ago. And so this information is in plain sight. You don't have to hide it. Same with Arthurian legend. This is what I would say is a 5th gospel. You know, we've got the 4 gospel. The 6th gospel. We've got the 4 gospels. We've got Acts of the Apostles. And then we have Arthurian legend. But you don't have to actually sort of keep it secret in a secret society. You can actually print it. Because only the people in the secret society will know what it's talking about, because you'll never know what Arthurian legend is talking about unless someone whispers in your ear and says, 1st century, talking about Jesus. Ah, now I understand the story. So you can keep these secrets in plain sight, and that's what they were doing, because it was the only way to tell this story, because otherwise you would get slow roasted, as lots of people did during the Catholic era. You would get slow roasted over a nice bonfire. I mean, like, even for the heresy of writing the first New Testament in English, the guy was burnt at the stake. I always forget who this guy's name was. Anyway, it was he was burnt at the stake at Vilvoorde in Belgium. He was a British guy, and he wrote the first New Testament in English. But because the Catholic Church didn't want you to know what the New Testament was talking about, they had banned the translation of the New Testament from the Greek and from the Latin. And so for the heresy of writing the New Testament in English, he was burnt at the stake. And those Bibles, if you ever get one of those, are extremely rare and very, very expensive, because there weren't very many were made. I wonder if I can quickly look it up. Tyndale. There we go. Of course, yes, it's the Tyndale Bible. So yeah, poor old Tyndale was burnt at the stake.
Wow.
In Vilvoorde in Belgium. And there's a little statue, a little plinth there with his details on it. It's not very exciting. They just got a small plinth there in the town of Vilvoorde. It's right just north of Brussels International Airport, if anyone's there at the time. Well worth seeing.
I want to thank you. This is also fascinating.
It's amazing what you can find in Arthurian legend, isn't it?
I've learned so much. Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, I'm never going to look at it the same way again. You know, but it all makes perfect sense. You know,
it does. I like to say that these are not jigsaw puzzles. Yeah, jigsaw puzzles is the best. I used to say they're crosswords, but I think a jigsaw puzzle is a better analogy. That in a jigsaw puzzle, you get all of these little pieces, all with a different part of the picture on it. But if you've got the correct jigsaw puzzle with the correct format, all of the pieces will fit together. And they will form a coherent picture of this history. If you're trying to fit pieces in that don't really fit into this story, the pieces in the jigsaw puzzle will not fit together. We all know that when you're doing jigsaw puzzles, and you can press as hard as you like, but they're not going to go into the jigsaw. They will only fit together if you've got a piece of true history, and then they all nicely mesh together. And not only do they fit together, but they actually form a coherent picture of the jigsaw. And that is what this history does. And all of the pieces fit together, and all of the new history that I keep finding fits into that same picture. And that's happened time and time again. Later on, we can talk about the Hyksos mosaic. But I, as it were, wrote about the Hyksos mosaic and put it on the front of my book 4 years before the mosaic was even discovered.
Incredible.
So it was predictive. I was talking about this guy, and I had a picture of him on the front of my book, on the Jesus King of Edessa book, before that mosaic had even been discovered, which is why when it was first published, I knew exactly who the guy was. And the archaeologists didn't, who were working on this. It's a mosaic from Judea again. And the archaeologists didn't know who this guy was. But I did, because I'd already written about him. So yeah, it's an interesting story, and it does make sense of this history. And as I said at the beginning, it has this strange conundrum that although I'm working from a historical perspective, not a religious perspective, it indicates that 90% of the New Testament is correct. It's a true history, except for the fact that a lot of this happened 40 years later than they normally say. So it happened in the AD 60s. And most of the characters are fairly well known because they were princes and kings of Edessa, this city-state that's been deleted from history. And it was deleted on purpose. This hasn't happened by accident. It was deleted on purpose by the Romans, by Vespasian, Emperor Vespasian, who became emperor at that time, because they didn't want you to know that this guy rebelled against Rome.
Right.
Of course, they don't want rebellions in the Roman Empire. So they don't want people praising and venerating a rebel against Rome. And so they recast this guy into this new guise as a pauper. So he's no longer, although he's called a king on 36 occasions, he's not really a king. He's only a pauper. And now they put into his mouth things like, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So suddenly it becomes very Rome friendly. Now we've got to respect Rome and pay our taxes and all of that sort of business. So they crafted it into a story which was perfect for the Roman Empire as a bastion against the more messianic, the more revolutionary sects of Judaism, which included the Nazarene. They were a messianic sect. And remember that Jesus was a Nazarene, of course. Right. So that's why this story was crafted in the fashion that it was. It was deliberately done by Rome to cover up the fact that there had been a revolt in that region against Rome. So it was very clever. It's very astute, very clever Roman propaganda. And it's propaganda that we're still using even today.
Absolutely. How can people find you?
Probably best on my Facebook site, which is ralph.ellis.144 on Facebook. I have a website, which is edfu books, edu -books.com. That's got all the books on it. Most of the books are on Amazon. Try to get the ones which are 2017 and later. They are the latest editions. And I've got a video channel, which is, I think it's just called Ralph Ellis. If you do a search for YouTube Ralph Ellis. My videos are the ones with a red and gold phoenix on the thumbnail. That will be my ones. So yeah, various ways of getting hold of me. And I do write quite a lot on Facebook, so that's quite active. I have quite a lot of posts and a lot of feedback on Facebook.
I want to thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. My God, I learned so much. That's why I like having guests on like you, because it changes my perspective, of history. So I want to thank you so much. I would love to have you on again to talk about other things, because I look through your books and I see that you have other topics that are just as fascinating as this.
Yes, there's quite a lot of topics. I go through the whole of the Bible, so there's a lot of other topics.
Absolutely. All right, Ralph, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. You have a good rest of your evening.
Indeed, thank you.
Bye-bye. All right. I mean, I didn't lie. I mean, I learned so much, and I hope you guys did too. Fantastic guest, knows his stuff, did a lot of research throughout his life on this stuff, and you have to admire the guy. I mean, I'm never going to look at King Arthur the same way again. All right. Anyway, tomorrow I'll be back at 6:30 p.m. Pacific with the show. I don't know what show it is yet, but I will be back. But have a good night, guys. If you like the show, share it with 5 people. If you hated the show, share it with 5 of your enemies. We're equal opportunity here at California Haunts Radio. And again, if you're watching from Facebook or YouTube and you haven't done so already and you like what you hear, please be sure to hit that follow button and hit that subscribe button. All right, well, I will see you. Have a great evening, you guys.